We'll be getting started shortly here. For those of who are joining, we have quite a few participants joining. Uh, so glad that we've had an interest. You're amongst over 100 people who've registered. So we want to give some time to get some folks in. All right. So May, Emmett, Walker, you all are set?
Yes.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Ethan Lindsay. I'm the Director of Community Philanthropy here at the Your Community Foundation of Greater Greensboro. Want to welcome you this morning for a very, very exciting morning that we are sure you're going to enjoy as we have our expanded community giving conversation, creating new philanthropic legacies, where we will talk about reimagining roles and relationships between community foundations and donors. Also want to just thank you all for joining us as we celebrate Black History Month today. We're going to learn a little bit more about the history and significance of Black philanthropy from one of the foremost thought leaders and respected experts on the subject, Dr. Emmett Carson, who's joining us early morning, and he's out on the West Coast. So we thank him for joining, and I'm sure he will remind me of this at some point, the favors that he's given me. But we're honored to have him, as well as to have May Douglas, who is local. She's a community volunteer and a philanthropist, but also the chair of our Black Investments in Greensboro Equity Fund, also known as BIG, which you will be hearing more about later. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge our sponsors today. We'd like to acknowledge the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, Lincoln Financial Group, and of course, the Community Foundation of Greater Greensboro. As we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. A reminder that this is a live recording. We will be posting this later, so please be aware of that, and the Zoom etiquette for live recordings as appropriate. Please adhere to those. Also would encourage you as we get along in this conversation to submit your questions in the chat feature, and we'll have staff monitoring the chat feature along the way as the dialogue goes, and we'll be looking for questions that will come up later in the question and answer period. Also, for those of you who are joining us for the first time and those who are familiar, Expanded Community Giving Conversations, we've been doing Expanded Community Giving Conversations for 5 years now as a part of the Expanded Community Giving Initiative. The Expanded Community Giving Initiative exists to engage more donors of color through a more intentionally focused donor education and cultivation efforts to our ethnically and racially diverse communities. With this work, we strive to heighten awareness of the Community Foundation, our services that are in line with the unique customs, culture, and histories and philosophies in giving of our rich, diverse donor base. ECG has been established since 2015, where clearly the objective was just to deepen our relationships with donors of color. Since the inception of ECG, we've seen an amazing growth of 20 new fund holders of color who've opened funds, newly established funds at the Community Foundation, approaching over $1.5 million in philanthropic assets. This success is a result of opportunities like this, where I like to say where we provide an opportunity to expose, engage, and educate our donors more about philanthropy in general, but particularly about the Community Foundation. Today is a very, very important milestone, as I've said earlier, for the Expanded Community Giving, because we will be talking about Big Equity Fund, which has been an outgrowth of this work. The Big Equity Fund was established as a concept by a group of Black donors in March of 2018 and was established as a permanent endowment in December of 2019 to address issues in the Black community. The Big Equity Fund is set up at the Community Foundation, uh, which under our guidance and with the assistance of Community Foundation, we are working with uh, the steering committee, a volunteer steering committee of the Big Equity Fund. We like this, we're proud to say the Big Equity Fund is Black initiated, Black led, Black funded, and has the distinction of being established by Black people and led by a group of Black donors with the initial funds of $250,000 raised by Black donors. The mission of the Big Equity Fund is to pool resources and leverage capital to break down systems that result in social economic disparities in the Black community. We'll be hearing more about the Big Equity Fund, but I cannot go any further without giving you an update for the Big Equity Fund and our fundraising efforts. As of today, we have had 96 donors have made commitments and gifts to the Big Equity Fund totaling $1 million. We're still on our way to an ultimate goal of $3 million. And part of today is to get you more information about this effort, but also to generate some excitement about it. So with that, I'll go to Walker Sanders, who will introduce our speaker and give you some more information and welcome to the Community Foundation in this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ethan. And I kind of wanted you to keep talking with the big announcements like that with $1 million. That is so exciting. It's awesome for this community. And we're really thrilled with the work that you're leading with expanding community giving. It really is kind of, in essence, created another division for the Community Foundation. That's one of community philanthropy. And it's very important for us to make sure what we're doing is really institutionalizing this work. This is not, we don't think of this as an initiative. This is a part of our organization, that's why we've really been focused on the endowment effort. It's never going away. We think this is an important, that's what endowment does. It makes ordinary efforts extraordinary by endowing them and making them permanent. So I'm really thrilled about this conversation today, especially. Emmett Carson, our speaker, has been what I like to see as a rock star in the field of community foundations since I've been in this field. He started talking about issues before it was popular talking about issues, and his role as the CEO of the Minneapolis Foundation many years ago. Emmett, I think that's probably back when we both had hair, and we were young and good looking in those days, maybe. But he was pushing forth issues when many of us in the community foundation field were afraid that if we got too far out in front of an issue, it may alienate many of our donors. And if we were focused on growing assets of the foundation, and we're also pushing issues that were controversial, it may turn off a lot of donors coming forward. But Emmett took the opposite tack, and it really inspired the entire field to be taking a different look at leadership and leadership roles that community foundations can be. So Emmett is really a person that leads conversations, that really pushes people's buttons in the right kind of way. He and I served on a national task force also a number of years ago. Emmett, I think when we both had hair, it was a national task force that was putting together a framework of community leadership for community foundations. And Emmett said something at that meeting that really inspired the entire work of putting that framework together for the field of community foundations. And that was that community foundations can no longer or should not be thinking of themselves as a neutral convener. If you're neutral, you're not going anywhere. If you're neutral, you have no opinion. If you're neutral, you're probably going backwards. That community foundations, for us to move forward as leaders in our community and looking at community leadership, we need to think of ourselves as objective conveners, of bringing together people objectively to talk about important issues that are important to our various communities. And we can have an opinion when you can be objective and have opinions, and you need to have opinions when you want to push important issues forward in the community. That message took the field of community foundation to a different level, to one where community foundations across the country today are taking on issues in a number of different areas that are important to those respective communities. And those conversations, even the conversation we're having today, may not have been inspired without the leadership that Emmett Carson has played to our field. Emmett, it's thrilled. It's great to see you. I'm sorry we're seeing you virtually, even though you're all the way out there on that West Coast. I still feel like we're connected. We'll be friends for life. And I could go on and talk about you for a long time, but people don't want to hear from me anymore, Emmett. I love to welcome you to this conversation and look forward to what you're going to be saying to us today.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Walker, for that overly generous introduction. And good morning to all of you. Walker's leadership of the Community Foundation of Greater Greensboro has been phenomenal. And as he indicated, we both knew each other when we had a lot more hair. So I also want to thank Mae Douglas for her energy and leadership in helping to establish the Big Equity Fund. And lastly, I must thank my good friend, Ethan Lindsay. You are fortunate to be able to draw on Ethan's deep knowledge and experience of Black philanthropy. Today's conversation is well-timed as February is Black History Month. In the next 10 minutes, and I have been told to stick to 10 minutes, I want to talk about the history of Black philanthropy, the perilous times we are living in today, and how Black philanthropy can help us to address the current challenges we face. As I begin, I want to assure you that my remarks are nonpartisan, non-political, and entirely my own. Throughout recorded history, there has been philanthropy, the giving of money, time, and things to help others. What has distinguished Black philanthropy, at least up until the 1970s, is that its roots are collective, people working together rather than people acting individually. Historically, even wealthy individual Black philanthropists engaged in philanthropy by working with others. Collective Black philanthropy has been the African-American community's all-purpose, never-fail solution for ensuring our socio-economic survival and advancement. The Black church has been the primary vehicle for much of our philanthropy and in many ways was the first community foundation. The Black church aggregated the limited resources of African Americans to combat systemic racism and established the first Black schools, banks, and insurance companies. It was through Black philanthropy that the Underground Railroad helped to free slaves and resettle them as freedmen, helped African Americans thrive during Reconstruction, protected us during the backlash of Jim Crow, and was the lifeblood of the Civil Rights Movement. Following the successes of the Civil Rights Movement, the capstone of which was the 1965 Voting Rights Act, Black philanthropy became increasingly less collective and more individual. As upwardly mobile African Americans began to get the jobs they deserved, could live where they wanted, and have their kids attend better schools, they became disconnected from their old neighborhoods and churches. The result, upwardly mobile and stationary African Americans no longer saw their destinies as being inextricably bound together. When President Obama was sworn in as the 44th president in January 2009, many people were convinced that America was a dream being realized. And when he was reelected 4 years later, that belief was cemented. Unfortunately, history appears to be repeating itself. After Reconstruction, African Americans faced widespread discrimination and violence that ushered in the legal segregation of the Jim Crow era. On January 6th, we saw insurrectionists consisting of white supremacists waving Confederate flags invade the nation's capital. Their goal was to locate, detain, and murder elected officials of both parties in a failed attempt to violently overturn a free and fair election. Never have we witnessed such events in America, and the counting of the legitimate votes of African Americans is at the heart of this conflict. These are neither political nor partisan observations, but a matter of public record. I realize that this is uncomfortable to hear. However, to reverse this situation requires that we accurately diagnose the problem. Contrary to what we had hoped and believed, Racism in America is not on life support, but is alive and well. This realization requires that African Americans and those of goodwill urgently reassess how we should respond to this new reality. This is not hyperbole. The threat posed by domestic violent extremists and white supremacist groups is so dire that for the very first time, the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI are shifting their focus and resources to combat these groups. It is also why 5,000 National Guard troops continue guarding the US Capitol today. Protecting our unencumbered right to vote must be added to the long list of systemic challenges facing our community. To be clear, I am advocating that we protect the right of African Americans to vote and that every legitimate vote be counted. I am not suggesting that nonprofit organizations engage in influencing who people should vote for, which is illegal. Other challenges disproportionately affecting African Americans include joblessness, housing insecurity, and food insecurity, all of which are exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. A pandemic, I might add, in which African Americans are disproportionately dying while having less access to the life-saving vaccines. We also must add criminal justice and police reform to this list. Innocent African American men and women continue to be murdered by police who face little or no consequences. The magnitude of these systemic challenges cannot be solved by acting as individuals. So what should African Americans and people of goodwill do? We must return to collective Black philanthropy with a modern twist. We must use community foundations and other institutions to channel our resources, maximize investment returns, and unapologetically use advocacy, lobbying, and public policy as part of our grant-making strategies. There is a pervasive misunderstanding that 501c nonprofit organizations, including community foundations, cannot engage in advocacy, lobbying, or public policy. They absolutely can, and we must insist that they do. What I would like for you to do is to financially support and be true to the mission of the Big Equity Fund. That mission states to pool resources and leverage capital to break down systems that result in socioeconomic disparities in the Black community. You have said pool resources and leverage capital. What I hear is that you want to aggregate your giving to act collectively. You have said that you want to break down systems that result in socioeconomic disparities in the Black community. What I hear is that you will engage in advocacy, lobbying, and public policy to confront institutional racism. Engaging in charity, supporting direct services, while important, will not break down systems. Stated differently, giving a hungry person fish to eat is charity. Teaching people how to fish changes the system. I believe that if you financially support and remain true to your mission, you will serve as an example of what African Americans must do in communities across the country. This will not be easy work. However, if generations before us could be beaten and killed to secure the freedoms we now enjoy, surely we can withstand the inevitable criticisms on social media. We cannot allow any group to make America more racist again. In closing, I'm reminded of a quote by the late Congressman John Lewis. Freedom is not a state, it is an act. It is not some enchanted garden perched high on a distant plateau where we can finally sit down and rest. Freedom is the continuous action we all must take, and each generation must do its part to create an even more fair, more just society. It is our generation's responsibility to both preserve the hard-won gains of past generations while further advancing the dream of equal rights for all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Emmett, for giving us a historical perspective of Black philanthropy and what we must be doing now. So one of the questions that I have, having heard your comments, is how do you get a broader Black community to understand their current role to advance the removal of disparities in the Black community? We're all here joined on a webinar through technology, but as we move forward as the Black Equity Fund Steering Committee, how do we engage a broader Black community around this message?
Well, I think the first part is information is power. And I think we have to call out what some of those systemic differences are and what accounts for that. And in doing so, we realize that we are still bonded together by racial issues. I think what happened is we thought, okay, race is no longer going to be a predominant part of our lives. And we will be, the great quote by Dr. King, we will be judged by the content of our character, not the color of our skin. And so as we can show concrete ways in which the color of our skin is predetermining our outcomes, not the content of our character, I think that will bind us back together. So I think it's information, and I think the information is right in front of us in so many ways. I'll use the pandemic as an example. Every piece of data says that our community and communities of color are disproportionately being affected by the COVID-19. And yet to date, while we're saying we want to make sure that the vaccinations are equitable and fair, and we aren't targeting the people who are actually most at risk. Why is that? If we're saying that's the case. So I think there are examples that abound. They abound in education. They abound in housing. You can pick a topic, and as Walker indicated, I want to be as transparent as I can here. Let's take police violence toward African Americans. I can't think of any examples of videotapes where an unarmed person turns his back on the police and starts to walk around to a car and he's shot in the back. I can't think of an example of someone other than a Black child who's playing in a park with a toy gun, and the police pull up, and within a minute and a half of showing up, that child is shot dead. I can't find examples of, other than a Black woman sleeping in her home, that's broken into by police and she's shot dead in her own home. And I can go on and on. I've never seen a video of someone other than a Black man in broad daylight with 4 police, and he's saying he can't breathe, having been pulled over for a bad check. So those kinds of examples ought to tell us that we are still being judged by the color of our skin, not the content of our character. And those of us who've had the benefit of civil rights and have had upward mobility and now have resources have to bind ourselves together to say, that could be our kid driving in the car. That could be our grandkid playing in the park. That could be my daughter sleeping in her home. Those are things that have to motivate us to act, I think. I'll be shorter with the other questions.
Now, just to follow up on that, because one of the goals that we have as part of the Big Equity Fund is how do we coalesce other Black service organizations, Black fraternities, sororities to assist in this work. Can you speak to your experiences and what you have found successful to get back to this collective approach that Black service and civic and fraternal and sorority organizations can support an initiative like this?
So I think you have to find carve outs and meet people where they are. The sad reality is that any topic any of those groups are concerned about, you will find racial disparities in that. And I think this is also African American groups, but also majority groups with whites and others, right? If they care about health and look at their mission statement, you can often look at their mission statement and say, you're not living up to your mission statement here. If you care about education, so I think the harder challenge with some of these groups, particularly African American groups, is that we are comfortable with charity. So it's great and it's wonderful to have a scholarship program. I benefited throughout my education by generous people who created scholarship programs. But that's in one bucket. But if you start to ask, why is it that schools in this zip code, we can tell your outcomes. There have been studies done by Harvard and Stanford that show 90% confidence. If you tell me what zip code you're in, I can tell you what your life outcome will be. It's the poor neighborhoods, it's the neighborhoods with communities of color. And even if you look at poor white communities, their mobility is much higher out of those communities than they are from African Americans and Latino households. So getting them to understand that that scholarship program, in some ways, charity, is maintaining the system, right? It's not trying to change the system. It's maintaining the system and trying to do a workaround. Going directly at why does that problem still exist is the systemic change part. And don't try to get them to do the whole loaf, if you will. Say to them, keep your scholarship program. It's not an either or, it's a smorgasbord. You can do both here. But you ought to be directing some of what you do toward the systemic piece. And as I've read the issue of the mission of the Big Equity Fund, that mission is the systemic part. So partner with us. You don't have to take the heat on the systemic part. Support our efforts on the systemic part, and you continue with the direct service part.
I love that approach. One of the things that we've had much success with over the last 6 to 7 months as we have started our campaign and raised our first $1 million is the fact that we have some wonderful white allies who have said, we like your vision. It aligns with what we personally want to do, either as a family, individual, or as an organization. Can you also speak to what you've seen in terms of how to successfully enlarge that group of white allies?
Again, I think white allies have always been important throughout civil rights efforts in America. You go back to the earliest days of escaping slaves, white allies were part of the Underground Railroad. They have connected at every phase. The founding of the NAACP and other historic organizations began with white allies at the table. So people of goodwill are always going to be a part of. I mean, you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, and I look at those marches. That's a multiracial, multi-ethnic group of people who've come together. So I think now more than ever, particularly among younger people, that is their mode of thinking. They come together based on the power of the ideas and the issues, and they see the disparities. They understand the systemic issues. And I think the difficulty is that people have to own what they know in their heads and their heart, but they are sometimes unwilling to voice. So I can't tell you how many donors throughout my career, white donors would pull me aside and say, Emmett, and this was to Walker's point, they would say, Emmett, I really believe in what you're saying. I'm heartbroken that I see this in the community that I live. I see the disparities in front of me every day. I'm worried about my social network. I'm worried about if I put my name to something that will harm me, it'll harm my business, it may come back to my family's opportunities to do certain things. So I feel like I'm caught. And I think you provide an opportunity in two ways. First, I would tell them how important it is for them to stand by the courage of their convictions. But if they're not there yet, that's why you can make an anonymous gift, right? And when you look at many nonprofit organizations and the old annual report that's now online, you see anonymous, 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 anonymous for those gifts. And it's because the more controversial an issue might be, the less willing some people, they know in their heads and their heart it's the right thing to do, but they also understand in the world of, well, who's for me and against me, which has been exacerbated in this period. I don't want that attached to me. I'm not that brave. I've got too much at stake. So I think you can have those conversations and say, for those of you who aren't there yet, that doesn't get you out of supporting this systemic work. You know it's right to do, you believe it, and this word anonymous, not attached to your name, allows you to support what you know to be right and avoid some of the risks. But I think the first thing you got to do is say, it would really help if you would put your name to it, because it gives it legitimacy that this effort is worthwhile. But if you can't get them there that way, then the anonymous piece I have found, people say, yeah, I can do that. I can do that.
I appreciate your sharing some possible techniques that we can use with the larger community. Obviously, we want to sustain this over a long period of time. And one of the things that we're also learning is that the idea of a big equity fund like ours here in Greensboro that was initiated and led and initially funded by Black donors is unique, not only in the South, but across the country. Can you just share, and you may have hit on this in your comments, about why a fund like this might have not been as successful in its ideation or launch in other communities? And what can you say to encourage us to keep going, to sustain it, and again, the necessity for it?
I think we are understanding as a larger community that we still have miles to go to get to where we want to be. And $1 million is a significant milestone of people coming together. It's easy to do your own thing, right? It's easy to do your own thing. It's easy to have your ego on it. It's my name on the list. I did it. I get to puff up and feel good about it. And I made that contribution. I made it happen. Getting people to say, and again, I think they can do both and. You can still make your contribution to your favorite charity to do that work and have your name listed, but you can also be part of the collective. You can also be part of the group. And if there's nothing you can be part of the group in, then there's a larger problem that I think you can help people struggle with. It's not give everything into the big equity fund, but if you can't find some part of your resource to make this an annual contribution to be part of the group. Look, Madam C.J. Walker, one of the wealthiest African Americans ever. She supported Booker T. Washington for self-help. She supported Du Bois. She supported Mary McLeod Bethune. She supported the NAACP. She understood. She could have she put her names on schools. but she also understood she needed to be part of the group. And I think we've lost that because we thought it was okay to be just individuals. So I think what you're doing is going to be seen at some point as the rebirth of collective Black philanthropy because of the magnitude of the challenges that will become more apparent. And no one person, no matter how wealthy by themselves, can take on the magnitude of the challenges we face.
Thank you, Emmett. I see there is a question in the chat. And it says, how important is it for a foundation to build trust within the Black community and ensuring that we don't just talk the talk, but also walk the walk?
Well, I think that's true for every institution, and particularly true for a community foundation because it has community in its name. It says by definition, we want to represent diverse interests. And community foundations, and Walker shared this, I don't believe in being neutral, because if you say you're neutral, you're like being neutered, and that's never a good thing. So the way I think community foundations build trust is by taking on the issues. And look, it doesn't, in every community, I always say, people know what the problems are. It's in that old movie, The Untouchables, with Sean Connery and can't remember the other actor, but the guy says, well, everybody knows where Al Capone's liquor stash is. It's who's brave enough to go in that door. You know what the issues are in your community. The community foundation ought to be a place to give voice to it's behind that door. That's the door we have to go through. I don't have all the answers. I don't have the resources to fix the problem, but I have the voice to raise it authentically. And by raising authentic issues that people will then say, wow, they actually talked about the unspoken thing that everybody knows, but no one's been willing to say out loud. You attract and bring in people. And that's what the big equity fund can start to do. And you do it around research and facts, not made up stuff. Research, local universities that you have there, you put it out there, and then you bring people to the table to say, this is our reality. It's uncomfortable, it's difficult, but this is what's been happening. How do we fix it? That isn't about money, that's about courage and will.
I think your latter comments also reflect some of the work that we as a steering committee have engaged in. We've had a couple of retreats. One of them initially was to establish our vision, mission, and values. And then about 6 weeks ago, we had a second retreat where we did exactly just that in terms of what you just commented on, Emmett, in that we are 12 Black donors, Black leaders, Black founders of the Big Equity Fund, but we're coming together as a steering committee from varied backgrounds, varied parts of the country, various professions, but we are coming together for the first time as a team. And so we're trying to do all of those organizational things to make sure that we learn how to work together, that we trust one another, and just learn about who each other is. And one of the most powerful exercises that our facilitators and coaches who are working with us took us through was a history timeline to think about what has happened in Greensboro and what are those times when we have been proud of when the Black community stepped up to impact change in the Black community, but also what are those times when we have failed the Black community. And so I liked your comments because I think we do have to face our own reality, and we're trying to do that as a steering committee to ensure that before we make any investments in the issues and the priorities that we have identified, that we ourselves understand what's going on in our community. And as our facilitators have said, and our coaches have said, reading reality truthfully in Greensboro. And I think we all have to be honest with ourselves about what's going on in this community so that we can honestly talk about the issues that we want to address in our community. I'm going to check to see if there are other questions.
Yes, May, I've been monitoring some that have come
Okay.
to me. We have one, this is directed to Emmett. Can you say a bit more about how do you talk about endowments with people who this may be a new approach for them? What are the advantages of the endowments as a precious tool for building equity in the future? And
Yeah. Go ahead.
And also, this is a simple one. Also, someone wants to know what type of change in relationships are required between community foundations and Black donors and other donors of color as we go forward.
So let me talk about endowment first. Endowments ensure that the resources are there forever to address the issues that you care about. And it's a difficult concept because the needs are so great, you can exhaust all of the money now, right? For whatever problem you want to address, all the money you could raise, you could put it toward one thing in 1 year, and the problem still wouldn't go away. You know, I was CEO of Silicon Valley Community Foundation. We had $12 billion with a B. And I used to say, if we could just take all that money, we would not solve the housing crisis in Silicon Valley. With $12 billion, we would not solve the housing crisis. So that's the magnitude of the problem. So by putting some of it away and building on it over time, you have a continual effort at making headway against the problem. And it goes back to, you know, what I was trying to say at the start. I don't think we ought to look at giving, myself, as solving the problem through our dollars. We ought to use our dollars to encourage conversation, the difficult conversations, to engage in public policy. At Silicon Valley, we helped pass legislation in California. When I was CEO of the Minneapolis Foundation, we helped pass legislation in Minnesota. So changing the laws and how people act didn't take millions of dollars. It took will and courage and research and lobbying to get people to understand. But we often think of our giving as fixing it, as opposed to our giving to change it. And endowments give you money over time that every year you get to change it. You get to do something about it because the problems are going to change, and the folk who don't want to see those change, they're going to do things. So it's going to be a chess game. And then the other question was community foundations and donors. And, you know, look, community foundations have to reflect over time the communities they serve. They need to reflect it on the board. They need to reflect it on the staff. They need to reflect it around the issues that they take up or don't take up. And so people of color have a BS meter, right? We're all adults here. And they can tell when people are authentically engaged with them and their issues, and they know where you just blowing smoke. And so I think that you prove it over time, right? It's like a good relationship, right? When you're in a good relationship, you know it. You know it. You have trust. It's affirmation every day. It's built over time. And so when the inevitable misstep happens, and it always happens, there's enough goodwill there to believe, I believe you just made a mistake. I think, and they can own it. Yeah, we made a mistake there. But if you don't build up trust and goodwill, then when a misstep happens, yeah, that's what I thought anyway. And so you gotta build trust by authenticity. And it's not believe me, it's show me. And so if people are saying, hey, I haven't seen it, have a conversation. This is what I need to see you do. Here are the kind of issues I need you to talk about that speak to me, that are authentic to me. And if I see you engage in that in good faith, if I'm willing to see you take a hit on that issue, right? And I would just say, having a speaker like me is a risk, right? This leadership, they've known me 20 plus years. They know what I'm gonna say, right? And they're putting it out there to say, we're comfortable enough to bring somebody that we know he's gonna, what he's going to say. And we're doing that to say, we're ready to engage in uncomfortable conversations in different ways, which isn't easy for them to do. So it's steps, it's trust, it's giving them feedback. We want more of that. I'm sure they're going to get some emails that said, were you crazy? Right? This who you brought in? But that's how they build trust. And it's changed for that, then you got to support them. You got to support the big equity fund, because that says, hey, these are the kinds of conversations I want this community to start to have. So it's a litmus test, and each of you get to decide. And everything, Black philanthropy isn't about how much you're able to give. Some of us can give some big bucks, and if you can, you should. But others may not be in a position today to do that. Well, send some check, which is an affirmation that, yes, I'm a part of this. I can find something to send to let them know this was important. I want to be part of the collective. And this is a check I can do now. And you can do an anonymous smaller check, an anonymous bigger check. But I want to be counted as part of this thing. I don't know where it's going to go. I don't know how it's going to develop. They're working it through. But I want to be part of a collective thing in my community that makes a difference against systemic challenges facing our community.
And Emmett, as we wrap up, I think you did a beautiful job of actually answering one of the other questions that was in the chat, which had to do with how about small dollar donations. And I think you adequately addressed that question. So I think as we wrap up, there are a couple of comments that you made that really resonate with me. And that is this notion of objective Black, collective Black philanthropy. I love that term. And I think as we move forward with the Big Equity Fund, we'll continue to focus on that. And your other point as it relates to connection to donors of color, and that's this issue of trust and goodwill, that we have to be courageous enough to reach out, connect with every level of donor so that as we move forward, we trust one another so that if there are mistakes made or mishaps, then it's well-intentioned. It's not something that's deliberate. So Emmett, we want to thank you for your wisdom, your experience. You're challenging us today as it relates to Black philanthropy. And at this time, what we'd like to do is to share with you a video. So Ethan, do you want to introduce the video?
Yes. Thank you, Emmett, and thank you, May. We are, and Kevin is going to cue this up, but before we get started, this is a promotional video of Big Equity Fund. We've talked a lot about it. We like to offer a visual for folks to be able to see this. We also want to thank First Bank for helping us get this produced, and as a gift to the Big Equity Fund and their investment for us to get this information out. They have graciously supported the creation of the Big Equity Fund video.
Greensboro is a very caring community. Greensboro is a great community to raise a family.
We're very well known for education, for NCA&T, Guilford, UNCG, Greensboro College, Bennett College, GTCC.
Greensboro is, a place with a lot of diversity. It's a community that I love. One of the things that became obvious to me early on is that I really wanted to help Greensboro be as great as it can be.
We really are going through a period of change, and I think that there's a big question as to what the identity of Greensboro is going to be going forward.
The idea is to create a corpus of capital that will then be infused back into the Black community and help dismantle socioeconomic disparity.
Greensboro, like a lot of communities, still has a lot of social segregation. So even though I've grown up here, there is a lot that I'm not familiar with in the community, and a lot that I don't know about the community. And that is a huge part of why I'm a donor to the Big Equity Fund.
The Big Equity Fund is a permanent endowment at the Community Foundation of Greater Greensboro. And it is the result of a group of Black leaders and Black donors coming together and sharing a common vision that we want to make life better for those in the Black community here. And so we've identified 3 priorities initially that we want to focus. One is on health disparities. Our second priority is related to education and the digital divide. And then the third issue that we've identified is small business ownership. There have been Black entrepreneurs in our community for years. More recently, anyone who has a business needs to know how to do digital marketing to sustain their business, to grow their business. So we want to be able to provide those support services to Black businesses so that they continue to grow.
We need to be able to put financial resources into the game to be able to level the playing field so that little kids that live in Greensboro have an opportunity to become educated, have good health, and actually achieve their best lives as opposed to fighting to survive.
We want to partner with existing organizations to collectively bring other Black organizations together to figure out how we can have a more collective approach as opposed to a siloed approach to getting the work done. We feel this is an opportunity for donors of color, and specifically with the Big Equity Fund, the Black community to come together and say, yes, we have resources, and yes, we want to use our influential capital, our reputational capital, our social capital, our financial capital, and intellectual capital to solve the issues in Greensboro.
We want the Big Equity Fund to pull the entire community foundation along so that everyone is aligned on this mission.
What I want to see is an enduring fund, an institution in Greensboro that will never go away, that people will love and continue to contribute to. Greensboro ends up being better than it's ever been if everybody can contribute to the greater good. But we need to start someplace, and so we're throwing the gauntlet down now here in Greensboro to try to start moving in the right direction.
Thank you all for your participation today. And as we close, just want to share with you the progress that we've made with the Big Equity Fund. It was referenced earlier that we have formed a steering committee of 12 Black donors and leaders who will decide the priorities, guide the work, and also manage the business of the fund. We organizationally have approved a charter. We have our vision, mission, and values. We also have a very comprehensive business case statement that outlines the benefits and the value of the Big Equity Fund to the Black community and the community at large. We also are using a model called Passing Gear Philanthropy as a way to help us decide the types of investments that we want to make. And as Emmett shared with us earlier, our goal is to move from charity to addressing the issues of structural racism. And we will look at our investments through this lens, along with the collective efforts of the rest of the community. We also are introducing to you today, the promotional video, thanks to First Bank and some others. We also have a new brochure and other collateral materials and an infographic that will also support us in our campaign raising efforts. We also now have a subcommittee of the steering committee that is a specific fundraising committee that will oversee the remainder of our campaign to help keep us on track. So as we mentioned earlier, we have an overall goal of 3 million, but our immediate goal now is that by August of this year, 2021, we do want to raise our second $1 million. If you recall, when we launched the fund this past August in 2020, it was during August, which is Black Philanthropy Month. So our goal is by August of 2021 to raise our second $1 million. And what we saw as a small idea in 2018 and set up the fund in 2019 has evolved into something that we think is really, really big. A group of Black leaders caught the vision early, and Blacks have a long history of changing the course of history in Greensboro, as we know. The sit-in movement in Greensboro by the Greensboro Four ignited change that created advancement opportunities for the entire community. And we see Big Equity Fund as the modern day way of igniting a movement that we think will change the course of history for current and future Blacks in our community. So it was mentioned earlier, in the last 6 to 7 months, we've already raised $1 million. So the idea of this fund is being quickly embraced by the community. And we think the time is now. We think it's relevant, and it's an important part of addressing the disparities that exist in the Black community in Greensboro. So if there's anything that we share today, and if our vision and mission align with yours individually, as a family, as an organization, then we ask that you reach out to Walker Sanders, CEO, Phelps Sprinkle, who is the VP of Donor Services, or members of his team, Emily Thompson, Ethan Lindsay, or myself as a volunteer. We thank you for joining us today. We think hopefully that you've been challenged, as we all have, and we hope that you will consider becoming a part of this collective work to build a big equity fund in Greensboro. Thank you.